there is a document that changed everything. Not because it revealed something that nobody had suspected, not because it contained information that the world had never imagined, but because it was written by the company itself, because the people who produced it worked in a glass-walled campus in Menlo Park, California, collecting their salaries and their stock options and their catered lunches, and in the course of doing their jobs, they produced a slide that said, in plain corporate English, that their product was making things worse for 1 in 3 teenage girls. And then their employer buried it. This is not a conspiracy theory. The documents are real. They have been read into the congressional record. They have been submitted as evidence in federal court. The researchers who produced them are real people with names and credentials. The executives who received them are real people who are still employed, in many cases, by the company that suppressed the research. What happened to those documents, and why, and what it tells us about the relationship between one of the most powerful corporations in human history and the children it profits from? That is the story we are going to tell. Instagram launched in 2010. Facebook bought it 2 years later for $1 billion. At the time, that price seemed almost absurdly high. Instagram had 30 million users and no meaningful revenue. What it had was something that Facebook understood very well, a design that made people want to keep using it. The specific mechanism was the image. Instagram was built around photographs, not text, not links, not the messy variety of things that Facebook itself had accumulated. Photographs. Your life curated into a visual feed. The best moments, the flattering angles, the carefully selected evidence that your existence was interesting and beautiful and worth looking at. For adults, this was a product. For teenagers, it was something else entirely. Adolescence is defined by social comparison. It is the period of human development in which identity is formed through the process of measuring yourself against the people around you. Am I attractive enough? Am I liked enough? Do I belong? These are not trivial questions for a teenager. They are, in a developmental sense, the questions. And Instagram had built a machine for answering them continuously in the most damaging possible way. The like button was a vote. Every photograph you posted was an item on a ballot, and the votes were counted publicly in real time, and the results were visible to everyone. A teenager who posted a photograph of herself and received 23 likes, while the girl she compared herself to received 300, had received a social verdict, expressed in a language that left no room for ambiguity. The algorithm made it worse. Instagram's recommendation system was not neutral. It watched what you engaged with, what you paused on, what you looked at twice, what you clicked, and it served you more of the same. For teenage girls who had shown any interest in bodies, in fitness, in beauty, in the particular aesthetic of thinness that saturates the visual culture of social media, the algorithm quietly turned up the dial. Not all at once, not in any way that felt deliberate or hostile, but steadily, insistently, in the direction of content that made ordinary teenage girls feel inadequate compared to a standard that was simultaneously omnipresent and effectively unattainable. The company knew this was happening. In 2019 and 2020, a research team inside Facebook conducted studies specifically designed to understand how Instagram was affecting its youngest users. They used surveys, they used behavioral data. They talked directly to teenage girls in focus groups and interviews, and those conversations were documented, and the documents were circulated internally, and the people who received them included some of the most senior figures in the company. The research found things that the company's public statements had been contradicting for years. It found that 32% of teenage girls said that When they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. Not marginally worse, not worse in ways that fell within the expected range of ordinary adolescent self-consciousness. Significantly, consistently, measurably worse. The platform was not neutral. It was not merely reflecting the pressures that teenagers already felt. It was amplifying them, and it was doing so through mechanisms that the company's own engineers had designed and could have modified. The research found that teenagers themselves identified Instagram as a contributor to their anxiety and their depression. This finding, the documents noted, emerged without prompting. The researchers were not leading the teenagers toward this conclusion. The teenagers arrived there on their own, consistently across different age groups and different regions and different demographic backgrounds. There was a slide, one particular slide from one particular internal presentation that became, when it finally reached the public, one of the most quoted corporate documents in recent American history. It read, "We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Teens blame Instagram for increases in rates of anxiety and depression." This reaction was unprompted and consistent across all groups. That slide was prepared by Facebook employees. It was presented to Facebook leadership. It was reviewed by people with the authority and the resources to change what the research had documented. And then, for years, nothing happened. Frances Haugen joined Facebook in 2019. She was not a newcomer to the technology industry. She had worked at Google and Pinterest before coming to Facebook, and she had experience with the specific questions of how algorithmic platforms affect the people using them. She was assigned to work on civic integrity issues, the ways in which the platform was being used to spread misinformation and fuel political radicalization. What she encountered there and in the broader internal culture of the company convinced her that Facebook had a pattern of identifying harms, documenting them, and then systematically choosing not to address them when addressing them would cost growth. When she left the company in 2021, she took copies of thousands of internal documents with her. She provided them to the Wall Street Journal, which published its Facebook Files investigation in September of that year. She then identified herself publicly and testified before the Senate Commerce Committee in October 2021. Her testimony was specific, documented, and devastating. She told the senators that Facebook's leadership knew that Instagram was harmful to teenage girls. She told them that the company had the internal research to prove it and had chosen to suppress that research rather than act on it. She told them that the metrics that drove decision-making within the company were engagement metrics: time spent, daily active users, advertising revenue, and that these metrics were structurally incapable of capturing or responding to the psychological harm the platform was generating in its youngest users. She told them that the company had chosen growth over safety, not accidentally, not through negligence, as a deliberate, considered business decision made by people who understood exactly what the research had found. The senators who questioned her were visibly shaken. What struck many observers about that hearing was the degree of bipartisan consensus in the room. Politicians who agreed on almost nothing found themselves aligned in their response to what Haugen was describing. Senator Richard Blumenthal described the company's behavior as a toxic product aimed at children with a ruthless disregard for their safety and mental health. Mark Zuckerberg did not appear at the hearing. He had been asked to. His written statement said that the characterization of the company's behavior did not reflect the company he knew. He said Facebook cared deeply about the well-being of its users. The slides were in the public record by the time he said that. Anyone who read them could make their own assessment. The specific design decisions that made Instagram harmful were not accidents of engineering. The like button, did not appear because nobody thought about what it would do. Variable reward schedules, the psychological mechanism that makes social media notifications so difficult to ignore, are well understood. The behavioral research on them goes back to B.F. Skinner's experiments in the 1930s. Pulling a lever and sometimes getting a reward in unpredictable intervals produces behavior that is more compulsive and more persistent than pulling a lever and always getting a reward. Slot machines work on this principle. So does checking your phone to see if anyone has liked your photograph. The people who designed Instagram's notification system knew this. The people who designed the algorithmic feed knew that showing users content similar to what they had already engaged with would increase engagement. The people who designed the Explore page, the section that served algorithmically selected content from accounts users didn't follow, knew that this would expose users to an ever-widening world of aspirational imagery that their own feeds might not have provided. These were deliberate choices. The question was never whether these choices would affect user behavior. The question was how. The internal research answered the question, and the answer created a problem. Because the choices that maximized engagement were also the choices that maximized harm. The more time a teenage girl spent on the platform, the more revenue the platform generated. And the mechanism that kept her on the platform longest was the same mechanism that the research had identified as most damaging to her psychological well-being, serving her an endless progression of increasingly concentrated body comparison content, kept her scrolling. It also made her feel progressively worse about herself. These two facts were not in tension within Facebook's decision-making structure. They were simply two different measurements of the same phenomenon. One measurement was visible in the engagement dashboard. One measurement was visible in the research that was eventually suppressed. The engineers and product managers whose careers depended on the engagement dashboard kept their jobs. The researchers who produced the suppressed findings continued to do research that continued to be suppressed. And the teenage girls who were caught between these two realities went on experiencing what they experienced without anyone telling them that the company that had built the platform they couldn't stop using had already measured what it was doing to them. Arturo Bajar had worked at Facebook for years before he left the company. He was an engineering director who focused on safety and well-being issues, and he was, by his own account, someone who genuinely believed that the concerns he was raising were being heard and would eventually produce change. He testified before Senate investigators in 2023, 2 years after the initial Facebook Files reporting, and what he described was a pattern that had become familiar to anyone who had followed the story closely. Concerns raised, research presented, meetings held, nothing changed. He told investigators that he had brought his concerns directly to Mark Zuckerberg. He said that Zuckerberg had acknowledged the issues, had expressed interest in addressing them. He said that the acknowledgement had not translated into meaningful action. He described it as a consistent pattern, genuine engagement with the problem in conversation, and then nothing in practice. He also told them about his daughter. She was a teenager who used Instagram. She had shown him messages she had received from strangers, messages that were sexually explicit and threatening, messages that no teenage girl should be receiving, messages that the platform's safety systems were nominally designed to prevent and were failing to prevent. He had brought that experience to his work. He had raised it as a specific, concrete example of the gap between what the company's safety infrastructure was supposed to do and what it was actually doing. He had been, he said, raising versions of this concern for years. Nothing had fundamentally changed. The story of what Facebook knew and what Facebook chose to do has a particular quality that distinguishes it from many corporate misconduct cases. It is not a story about knowledge that was ambiguous or about decisions that were made under genuine uncertainty. The research was clear. The findings were specific. The people who received the research understood what it said. The choices that were made afterward were made in full awareness of what the research showed. This is what makes the buried slide so significant. The researchers who produced it were not issuing a warning about possible future harms or speculating about theoretical risks. They were documenting present reality. They had measured it. They had the numbers. They had the testimony of the teenagers themselves, given freely and without prompting, describing in their own words what the platform was doing to them. The decision to bury that research was a decision made by people who had read it. What followed was not the swift regulatory response that many advocates had hoped for. The United States does not have comprehensive federal legislation governing how technology platforms are designed in relation to children's psychological health. The legal frameworks that existed were largely insufficient to address what the research had documented. Legislative proposals were introduced, most did not pass. The lobbying presence of the technology industry in Washington is substantial. The legal proceedings were more active. By 2023, a coalition of state attorneys general had filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Facebook, alleging that the company had deliberately designed its platforms to be addictive to minors and had deceived the public about the safety of its products. The internal research that Haugen had provided became central evidence. The teenagers at the center of this story, the girls whose psychological well-being was the subject of the buried research, whose experience on the platform had been documented and then set aside. Some of them have spoken publicly. Their accounts share certain qualities, a recognition that something felt wrong about the platform, even when they were using it compulsively. A difficulty they could not articulate at the time between the online version of their social world and the offline one, and the way that difficulty made both harder to navigate. A connection visible only in retrospect between their heaviest periods of Instagram use and the periods when they felt worst about themselves. 1 in 3. That is the number the research produced. 1 in 3 teenage girls using Instagram reported that the platform made their body image issues worse. That number describes not a crisis at the margins, but a feature of ordinary adolescent experience for an entire generation of young women. Girls who are now young adults who grew up with this platform as a constant presence in their most formative years, who cannot fully know what their development would have looked like without it. The company that designed the machine that shaped those years knew what it was doing. It measured the damage, it documented the damage, it circulated the documentation through its internal channels and presented it to its leadership. And then it chose the metrics that couldn't see the damage, and it kept growing.